The wedding was the grandest event Tampa had seen in years. Judge Melanie Carter, just 25, stood at the altar, her flowing white gown shimmering under the golden sunset. Her blonde hair, pinned back in soft curls, framed her youthful face, making her look every bit the successful young woman she had become. Standing beside her was Rick Dawson, a man 20 years her senior. Rugged and weathered by years of military service, he carried himself with confidence despite the slight limp he had earned from an old war injury. To the guests, they appeared like an unusual match: Melanie, a brilliant and ambitious judge with a bright future, and Rick, a former Marine who now relied on his VA benefits to get by. Yet, the couple seemed deeply in love, exchanging vows with unwavering gazes. The wedding took place at an exclusive beachfront resort in Tampa, attended by Melanie's colleagues from the legal world, Rick's small and distant family, and close friends. Margaret and Charles Carter, Nani's adoptive parents, beamed with pride as they watched their daughter say, "I do." But in the back of the room, unnoticed by most, an elderly woman sat frozen in her seat, her fingers gripping a strand of pearls tightly. Her face had gone pale the moment Rick stepped up to the altar. She had seen him before many years ago, and a sickening feeling crept over her as she realized exactly who he was. Melanie and Rick's honeymoon was brief. Within a week, she was back in the courthouse, presiding over high-profile cases, while Rick settled into her home. To the public, they were the perfect power couple, a young, accomplished judge and her strong, battle-worn husband. But behind closed doors, their marriage was not as perfect as it seemed. For years, Melanie had suppressed her curiosity about her biological parents. Her adoptive parents had always been loving, and she had never felt the need to dig into her past. But as she grew older, she couldn't ignore the nagging questions. A private investigator had helped her uncover limited information. Her birth mother's name was Catherine Dawson, but her father remained unknown. That was until she tracked down Rick Dawson. Instead of feeling disgusted at the revelation that this man was her biological father, she was drawn to him. Rick was everything she had imagined: strong, authoritative, and dangerous. Their bond twisted into something unnatural, something forbidden. Rick, always a man of opportunity, realized what this meant for him. Marrying Melanie would give him financial stability. Her judge's salary and his VA benefits ensured he would never struggle again. But Melanie had bigger plans. She wasn't just seeking a husband, she was seeking control. And soon, no one, not even her adoptive family, would stand in her way. The deaths began just 2 months after the wedding. The first was Margaret Carter, Melanie's adoptive mother. On a warm September evening, she was found lifeless in her bedroom, her face frozen in an expression of surprise. The official cause of death? Heart failure. The police found no signs of foul play. After all, Margaret was in her 60s, and sudden heart issues weren't unheard of. But to those who knew her, it didn't make sense. Margaret had always been in good health with no prior heart conditions. Despite this, there was no autopsy, no investigation, just a quick funeral, arranged almost too efficiently by Melanie. Charles Carter, grief-stricken, barely noticed how quickly things moved. There were no lingering questions, no suspicions. The case was closed and life went on. But Melanie and Rick knew the truth. Margaret's death hadn't been natural, it had been planned. And it was only the beginning. Barely a month later, another tragedy struck. Charles Carter, still reeling from the loss of his wife, met an untimely and tragic end. He was found at the bottom of the stairs in his home, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle. The official report ruled it as an accident. He had been drinking, lost his balance, and tumbled down the staircase to his death. But Charles had never been reckless with alcohol. Those who knew him found it strange, but no one dared question it. The authorities found no evidence of foul play, and just like before, Melanie took charge of the funeral, ensuring there were no delays, no further examinations. With both Margaret and Charles gone, Melanie inherited everything: the house, their life savings, and every investment they had made. Rick played the grieving son-in-law perfectly, comforting Melanie as they accepted condolences. To the outside world, they were simply a young couple enduring unimaginable loss. But behind closed doors, their relationship was far from normal. The balance of power had shifted. Melanie had gotten what she wanted: control. And she wasn't done yet. With Melanie now financially independent and completely free from her adoptive parents' influence, she set her sights on her next victim. This time, it was Rick's own brother, Daniel Dawson. Unlike Rick, Daniel had chosen a quiet, stable life in Georgia. A former soldier, he had settled into civilian life with discipline, avoiding trouble and focusing on his small business. When Melanie called him, her voice was warm and inviting. "We want to reconnect as a family," she told him sweetly. Daniel, having no reason to be suspicious, agreed to visit. When he arrived in Tampa, Melanie and Rick welcomed him with open arms, treating him to drinks and a home-cooked meal. That night, they sat together in the guest house, reminiscing about old times, drinking late into the night. But when morning came, Daniel was dead. The official cause? A heroin overdose. The coroner ruled it a self-inflicted tragedy, despite Daniel never having a history of drug use. His friends and colleagues were shocked. It didn't add up. But just like with the Carters, no one looked deeper. The case was closed without further investigation. What no one realized was that Daniel had been drugged. The heroin in his system had been laced with a powerful sedative, ensuring he never woke up. His sudden death meant one thing: his VA benefits, with no living spouse or children to claim them, automatically transferred to Rick. Once again, Melanie and Rick walked away unscathed, richer than before. Their plan was working. No one suspected a thing, but they had overlooked something, or rather, someone. Detective Samuel Grayson had started to notice the pattern, and he wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. While Melanie and Rick believed their plan was flawless, they had underestimated the power of an old woman's memory. Eleanor Dawson, Rick's elderly aunt, had attended the wedding months ago, and from the moment she saw Rick standing at the altar, something about him had unsettled her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen him before, not just as a relative, but in a much darker context. Eleanor had spent the last few months piecing together her memories, revisiting old photographs, and asking quiet questions. And when she finally realized the truth, that Rick Dawson was the same man from a disturbing chapter in her past, she knew she had to speak up. But before she could share what she had discovered, tragedy struck again. Late one night, Eleanor's house went up in flames. The fire, initially blamed on faulty wiring in the kitchen, spread rapidly, consuming everything in its path. When firefighters arrived, they found Eleanor's body in the living room, far from the fire's point of origin. Her injuries suggested she had already been unconscious when the flames reached her. To most, it seemed like an unfortunate accident, but to one person, it was a glaring red flag. Detective Samuel Grayson, a veteran investigator with over 30 years on the force, had already started keeping track of the unusual deaths connected to Melanie and Rick. The pattern was impossible to ignore: 4 deaths in just 4 months, all conveniently benefiting the newlyweds. When he reviewed Eleanor Dawson's fire report, something stood out immediately. The burn pattern suggested an accelerant had been used, and the fire had been deliberately set. Grayson's instincts told him this was no accident. Someone had silenced Eleanor before she could reveal what she knew. Now, he was certain, these deaths weren't coincidences. They were murders. And he was going to prove it. Determined to uncover the truth, Detective Grayson began meticulously retracing the events leading up to each death. He started with Daniel Dawson's toxicology report, which had initially ruled his death as a heroin overdose. But something about it didn't sit right with him. Daniel had no history of drug use, and the heroin in his system had been unusually pure, far too pure for a street-level purchase. This suggested that it wasn't a typical overdose, but something staged. When Grayson had the toxicology results quietly re-examined, a chilling discovery was made. The heroin had been laced with a hospital-grade sedative, commonly used to sedate patients before surgery. Daniel had been drugged before the overdose was staged. This was no accident, it was murder. Grayson then turned his attention to Margaret and Charles Cutter. Margaret's medical records showed no history of heart conditions, yet she had supposedly died of sudden heart failure. Charles, a man known for being cautious with alcohol, had allegedly been so intoxicated that he fell down the stairs to his death. Individually, both cases might have been written off as tragedies, but together, they painted a sinister picture. Then there was the biggest piece of the puzzle, Melanie Carter's adoption records. After digging through court archives, Grayson finally found what he was looking for, Melanie's original birth certificate. Her mother's name was listed as Catherine Dawson, but the father's name had been left blank. His gut twisted as he cross-referenced military records from the time. Catherine Dawson had been involved with a Marine named Rick Dawson who had been dishonorably discharged from misconduct. The timeline fit. If Rick was Melanie's father, then their marriage wasn't just built on lies. It was something far more disturbing. Grayson now had enough circumstantial evidence to know something was deeply wrong, but he needed concrete proof before making a move. He began tracking Rick's financial records, noticing a pattern. After each suspicious death, significant amounts of money had either been transferred into Rick's accounts or withdrawn in lump sums. The insurance payouts, inheritance money, and VA benefits all seemed to flow directly into Rick and Melanie's possession. However, Melanie, being a judge, was careful. She had ensured her name was never directly linked to the money on paper. She had gained nothing. But Grayson knew better. To build his case, Grayson needed a witness. He returned to Eleanor Dawson's neighborhood, speaking to those who had known her. That's when he found Mrs. Jameen Porter, Eleanor's longtime neighbor. At first, she was hesitant to talk, fearing getting involved. But when Grayson explained what he had uncovered, she broke down. That night, she whispered, I saw a car parked outside Eleanor's house. It was late, past midnight. A man got off. He was tall, stocky, walked with a limp. She hesitated before adding, I swear it looked like Rick Dawson. That was the missing piece Grayson needed. He immediately pulled traffic camera footage from the area. Sure enough, the recording showed Rick Dawson's car near Eleanor's house just minutes before the fire started. Rick had been there. He had made sure Eleanor would never reveal what she knew. Armed with this new evidence, Grayson knew he was getting close. But he also knew that Melanie and Rick were dangerous. If they suspected that someone was closing in on them, they wouldn't hesitate to kill again. He had to be careful. The trap was set. Now, all he had to do was wait for them to make their next move. Detective Samuel Grayson knew he had to act carefully. He had built a strong circumstantial case, but he needed one final push to break it wide open. Melanie Carter was smart, too smart to leave direct evidence of her involvement. Rick Dawson, on the other hand, was reckless, driven by arrogance and greed. If one of them was going to make a mistake, it would be Rick. Grayson decided to rattle him. He started by making his presence known. On a Monday morning, as Melanie walked into the courthouse, she found Grayson waiting near the security checkpoint. Dressed in his usual gray suit, he stood sipping coffee with a file in his hand. Their eyes met, and he gave a slow, knowing nod. Good morning, Judge Carter, he said smoothly. Melanie hesitated for only a fraction of a second before regaining her composure. Detective Grayson, she said with polite disinterest. To what do I owe the pleasure? Grayson smiled. Just doing my job. Funny thing about my job, it sometimes leads me to the same people over and over again. For a brief moment, he caught something in her expression. Annoyance? Fear? Whatever it was, she buried it quickly. Well, I hope you find what you're looking for. Oh, I already have, Grayson replied casually. But you know how investigations go. Sometimes you just need to let people bury themselves. This time, he saw it clearly. Her fingers tensed against the handle of her briefcase, and her jaw tightened ever so slightly. Without another word, she turned and walked away, but Grayson knew the cracks were beginning to show. That night, he decided to push Rick even further. He found him at a rundown bar just outside town, nursing a beer while watching a football game. Sliding into the booth across from him, Grayson placed a thick folder on the table. Mind if I join you? he asked. Rick's eyes narrowed. What do you want? Just a friendly chat. Grayson casually flipped the folder open, reviewing copies of old documents, Melanie's birth certificate, her adoption records, and a photo of her biological mother, Catherine Dawson. He tapped the name with his finger. You remember her, don't you, Rick? Catherine Dawson. Your old girlfriend. The one who had a baby before she died. Rick went pale. His grip on the deer tightened. Grayson leaned in. That baby didn't disappear, Rick. She grew up, became a judge, and then one day she married a man named Rick Dawson. His voice dropped lower. That's you, isn't it? Rick's breath hitched. He clenched his jaw, trying to hide the panic creeping in. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. Grayson smirked. I think I do. And here's the kicker, I don't even think Melanie knew at first. But you did. You knew exactly who she was when you married her. Rick shoved the folder away and stood up abruptly. You don't have proof. Grayson took a slow sip of his coffee. Not yet, he admitted. But I will. And when I do, you and your little life are going down. Rick stormed out of the bar without another word. Grayson exhaled. He had just thrown a lit match into a dazzling-soaked pile. Now, all he had to do was wait for the explosion. Grayson knew Rick was rattled. A man like him, when backed into a corner, would do one of three things: run, lash out, or try to cover his tracks. That night, he put a surveillance team on the Dawson house, watching for any sudden movements. He didn't have to wait long. At exactly 2:47 a.m., Rick Dawson left the house alone. He drove fast, heading straight for the courthouse. Grayson, following at a safe distance, immediately realized what he was doing. Rick wasn't running, he was destroying evidence. Rick parked in a dark alley behind the courthouse, entered through a side door, and disappeared inside. A minute later, smoke alarms blared. Damn it, Grayson muttered, radioing for backup as he rushed toward the building. By the time he got inside, the records room was already in flames. Rick had set fire to any evidence Melanie might have overlooked, hoping to erase their connection. But he had made a critical mistake. The security cameras were still active. As firefighters worked to contain the blaze, Grayson secured the footage. It showed Rick Dawson entering the courthouse and leaving just as the fire erupted. He had destroyed evidence, but in doing so, he had created even more proof of his guilt. That morning, Grayson got the final signatures on the arrest warrants. At sunrise, a team of officers arrived at the Dawson home. Melanie Carter was in the kitchen, sipping coffee, when they knocked on her door. She didn't resist. She didn't even speak. With an eerie calmness, she placed her cup down and turned to the officers, extending her hands as they cuffed her behind her back. Rick, on the other hand, panicked. He fled in his car, leading police on a 2-hour high-speed chase through Tampa before crashing into a ditch. When officers pulled him from the wreckage, he was still screaming that they had no proof, that it was all a setup. But the evidence told a different story. With both of them in custody, Grayson began putting together the final pieces of the case. The court case that followed was one of the most shocking in Florida's history. The truth about Melanie Carter's parentage was made public, shaking the legal world. Prosecutors laid out the chilling details. Rick Dawson had knowingly married his own daughter, and together, they had orchestrated a string of murders for financial gain. But the most shocking twist came when Melanie and Rick turned on each other. Rick, desperate to save himself, claimed that Melanie was the mastermind. She planned everything, he told the jury. She used me. I was just a pawn. Melanie, in turn, played the victim. Cold and calculating as ever, she insisted that she had been manipulated by Rick. I didn't know, she said softly in court. I swear, I didn't ever he was. The jury didn't believe either of them. With forensic evidence, financial records, and the security footage from the courthouse fire, both were found guilty. Rick Dawson was sentenced to life without parole. Melanie Carter, once a rising star in the legal world, was handed the same fate. As they were led out of the courtroom in shackles, Grayson felt a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served. Another case closed. But he knew that somewhere out there, another criminal was waiting. Another case would come, and he would be ready. With Melanie Carter and Rick Dawson convicted and sentenced to life without parole, the shockwaves of their crimes continued to ripple through Tampa. The once promising young judge was now a disgrace, her name synonymous with deception and murder. The legal community was in disbelief. How could someone so brilliant, so accomplished, have committed such atrocities? Meanwhile, Rick Dawson's downfall was less surprising. To those who knew him, his history of bad business deals, criminal behavior, and manipulative nature made it clear he was always walking the edge of the law. What no one had anticipated was the horrifying truth that he had knowingly married his own daughter, creating a twisted partnership fueled by greed and control. Despite their convictions, the case wasn't over for Detective Samuel Grayson. He spent weeks finalizing reports, ensuring every piece of evidence was airtight, so there would be no appeals or loopholes. He also revisited the families of the victims, offering closure where he could. Margaret and Charles Carter's close friends still struggled to accept how quickly Melanie had discarded the people who raised her. Daniel Dawson's military friends were outraged, knowing he had been framed as a drug addict. And Eleanor Dawson's neighbors mourned the woman who had seen the truth but hadn't lived long enough to reveal it. The case had been solved, but the scars left behind would remain forever. As Grayson wrapped up the investigation, he reviewed every detail once more. What haunted him most wasn't just the murders, but the psychology behind them. Had Melanie truly known Rick was her father before they married? Or had she only discovered the truth later, after they had already begun their killing spree? And if she had known, what did that say about her? Was she a victim of Rick's manipulation, or had she embraced the darkness willingly? These were questions no courtroom could answer. One thing was certain: Rick had known. The moment he saw Melanie's adoption records, he realized who she was, and rather than stay away, he had chosen to pull her into his world of crime and corruption. Whether out of a sick sense of control or a twisted version of love, he had shaped her into a killer. But what Grayson found even more unsettling was how quickly Melanie had adapted. She had manipulated, deceived, and ultimately outplayed even Rick himself. Had she always been capable of such evil? Or had Rick simply awakened something that had always been inside her? Even behind bars, Melanie remained an enigma. She refused interviews, declined to testify further, and showed no remorse. Rick, on the other hand, fell apart in prison. Isolated and powerless, he became a paranoid wreck, lashing out at guards and fellow inmates. Without Melanie by his side, he was nothing. With the case officially closed, Detective Grayson sat in his office, staring at the now sealed files. Another monster behind bars. Another web of lies untangled. Yet, the weight of the case lingered. He had solved dozens of homicides over his 30-year career, but this one was different. It wasn't just about murder, it was about power, deception, and the darkest corners of human nature. He thought about Melanie Carter, a woman who had been given every opportunity in life, yet had chosen a path of destruction. He thought about Rick Dawson, a man so consumed by greed and control that he had crossed every moral boundary imaginable. But more than anything, he thought about the victims, Margaret and Charles Carter, who had raised a daughter that ultimately betrayed them, Daniel Dawson, whose trust in his brother had cost him his life, and Eleanor Dawson, the old woman who had seen the truth but had died before she could speak it. They were the ones who mattered. As Grayson stood to leave, he glanced at the bulletin board in his office, now cleared of Melanie and Rick's faces, ready for the next case. He knew there would always be more crimes, more killers who thought they were untouchable. And as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would be there to catch them. Justice had been served. But his work was never done.